So good afternoon. I'm Faye Riva Cohen. I'm the liaison for the University of Minnesota Alumni in the Pennsylvania area. And today we're bringing you a program that is going to be presented by Harold M. Goldner, Esquire. I am also an attorney, so I may pop in at certain times or ask questions of Harold as we're both involved in these particular issues, which is mandating COVID-19 vaccines in the workplace, some of the law behind it, some of the issues that have definitely arisen in the workplace. And to just give you some information about Harold, he's of counsel to Kraut Harris PC, which is a law firm in Blue Bell of Montgomery County. He has extensive experience representing employees and employers in contract, employment discrimination, non-compete, non-disclosure, and trade secret information, and he handles those claims through trial, verdict, and appeal. He prepares employment contracts, human resources policies, and procedures for employers, as well as offering training on the issues of employment claim avoidance. He drafts and interprets restrictive covenants and other professional contracts on behalf of those business seeking to secure their assets and for employees looking to make career changes, and enforces those contracts in state and federal courts. He's been a trial lawyer for more than 41 years with courtroom and appellate experience. He's been president of the Eastern Pennsylvania affiliate of the National Employment Lawyers Association. He's past chair of the Labor and Employment Law section of the Pennsylvania Bar Association, and he has some other very good credentials. His Minnesota connection is that he's on the board of directors of the Minnesota Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company, and he holds an LLM in trial advocacy from Temple University School of Law, a JD from Boston University, and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. He also plays the oboe. He's the only one I know who plays the oboe. And he gazes stars with the Delaware Valley Amateur Astronomers, of which organization he is president. So I'm thrilled to be able to have Harold with us today. And if any of you have questions, if you have an opportunity to review this program, please feel free to contact the Alumni Association, and Harold will be glad to answer those questions, or I'll be glad to answer those questions. Thank you. So Harold, I'll leave it to you to begin.
Thanks. So, and I'll actually be out in Minneapolis next week, coinciding with the Leonid meteor showers, which will probably be drowned out by a little bit too much moonlight. But that November board meeting always seems to coincide with the Leonids. Someday they'll match up perfectly, but not this year. A long time ago, we didn't really have employees. If you think about Europe during the medieval period and what is commonly referred to as the Dark Ages, the king, the royalty, they sort of were supposed to take care of their serfs. And in exchange for that, the serfs showed fealty. And as a result, in Europe, there has adopted an employment law environment that is much more protective, where the employer has more assumed obligations towards the employee, but the employee also has more assumed loyalty. This country, on the other hand, was settled by the likes of Benjamin Franklin, who were indentured servants. We also have a long history of slavery in this country. We have a lot of people who came to this country to escape oppression from Europe. And as a result, the American rule of employment has really risen up as one of employment at will, where an employee can be terminated at any time for a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. The employee can also leave at the drop of a hat for whatever reason they want to leave. And when you mix the American system of employment, of at-will employment, with a pandemic, you have a very, very interesting mix. And that's what we have been facing since March of 2020, a year which seemed to go, March of 2020 seems to have been the longest month that I can ever remember. Um, when we talk about employment at will, the only exception is for violations of statute or violations of public policy. When somebody is mistreated or does not get appropriate treatment in the workplace, it's usually in terms of, was it based on their race, their sex, their religion, their age over 40, their national origin, a gender affinity and identity, genetic information, or a disability. And a disability is an actual, is a mental or physical uh, disability, meaning that they are able to perform the essential functions of their job, but they require an accommodation. And religion also has an accommodation piece. And I give you all of those because they fit, that framework for employment law fits into the environment of a pandemic and an environment where there are mandates to be vaccinated, there are mandates to wear a mask, and there are mandates to behave a certain way. And the common refrain you hear from what I'll refer to affectionately as COVIDiots is, you can't infringe upon my freedom not to wear a mask. You can't infringe upon my freedom not to be vaccinated. And believe it or not, the United States Supreme Court dealt with this over 100 years ago. In a case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Reverend Jacobson was a Swedish minister who had received an earlier version of the smallpox vaccine in the late 19th century, as a result of which, he claimed, he was subject to rashes and hot flashes that required him to be wrapped in cold blankets and so forth. And then his son also received the vaccine and also had a bad reaction. Now, if he was to be believed, it sounds like there was some allergic reaction to the smallpox vaccine, which did involve eggs, yolks, and so forth and so on. But and this was an earlier period of vaccination. And vaccine, by the way, comes from the Latin word vacca for cow, because the smallpox vaccine came from cowpox. But I don't want to get into too much epidemiology. But what happened was Massachusetts passed a law that said that boards of health, local boards of health, could require people to be vaccinated. And in Massachusetts' case, if you didn't get vaccinated, you'd be fined $5. Now, this is $5 in 1904. And what happened was Reverend Jacobson refused to be revaccinated. Apparently, there was a booster required, and he was busted. And he went to jail. And he appealed his conviction, or he fought his conviction, claiming that there's plenty of people who say that the vaccine isn't a good idea. A lot of his explanations were exactly what you're hearing now. He said that he had the freedom not to be vaccinated. He had the freedom, the Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution guaranteed him the right. The spirit of the Constitution guaranteed him the right not to be vaccinated. And Justice Harlan, who's better known as the great dissenter for being on the dissenting side for so many years, wrote the opinion of the court, which said that other people, the public, has the freedom to be free from disease, the freedom not to be exposed to communicable disease, the freedom to live their lives with maximum health. And therefore, the police power of the state, and I'm not talking about police. Police power is what powers the states retain. The police power of the state included the right to mandate vaccination. So that was well settled 116 years before COVID-19 came along. So now what we're dealing with is, and when we talk about employment discrimination or trampling on somebody's employment rights, we're talking about advertising, hiring, promotion and wage adjustment, firing, terms and conditions of employment, who gets to work, where they get to work, what their assignments are, what their hours are, and retaliation. And COVID-19 and the pandemic has brought to the workplace new issues relating to firing, terms and conditions of employment, and in particular, retaliation. So there are a whole bunch of statutes, legislative enactments that were already in existence before the pandemic. Each state has its own anti discrimination law. Pennsylvania does. That's where I'm speaking to you from. I know Minnesota also has its own anti discrimination law. There's also federal law. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act doesn't prohibits discrimination. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's the Family and Medical Leave Act, which provides for up to 12 weeks leave for employees of companies of more than 50, where you've worked for more than a year, you get up to 12 weeks of leave. And there's also the Genetic Information and Non-Disclosure Act of 2008, a law which, by the way, you didn't see a whole lot of involvement of until the pandemic. And now the involvement of vaccinations are triggering people to go, well, I can't get a vaccine because of certain information in my background that I don't have to tell you because of GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Then you had this last March. It was fun. It was the closest thing as a lawyer I did to surfing. There were a raft of new laws that came out. There was first the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and then there was the CARES Act. There were a whole series of legislative enactments that provided for emergency relief in the face of a pandemic that bore upon the workplace. For example, the whole idea of PPP loans was there were employers that wanted to lay people off, and the government said, well, wait, we'll loan you money if you don't fire those people. And if you keep them, we'll treat that loan as a grant. And they implicated the IRS in the process, and the IRS started issuing rules about, because a lot of it was built as a tax credit, and the IRS started issuing rules about the workplace, and the Department of Labor was going, well, wait a minute, that doesn't necessarily jive. And the CDC was going, but these are what guidance we think you should follow. And then you had the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission also getting into the act about what constituted discrimination. Who can you require to take time off? How much information can you take from somebody who says, I need to take time off because I have COVID-19? Well, or because somebody in my family does. And you start to get, well, let's just say when you have the intersection of workers' compensation and the Family Medical Leave Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, we employment lawyers refer to that affectionately as the Bermuda Triangle of employment law. Workers' compensation, FMLA, and ADA. And this quagmire was just worse than any Bermuda Triangle. It was, I guess, the closest thing in outer space would be a wormhole, and we're not sure those even exist. So you have everybody trying to get into the act of enforcing pandemic laws. You have county and municipal departments of health. You have some counties in Pennsylvania didn't have departments of health, so they had to borrow departments of health from Delaware County, which touches on the southern part of Philadelphia, has never had a Department of Health. So they were using the Chester County Department of Health to help them out. You had state departments of health. I don't know what she was called, but Rachel Levine, who was sort of the state doctor, became so predominant and in her role during the COVID pandemic. She was ultimately appointed as an assistant Secretary of Health, I believe, in the Biden administration. You had state unemployment compensation offices getting into the act because the CARES Act provided for new types of unemployment compensation insurance, including unemployment compensation for those who were in the gig economy. You had the United States Centers for Disease Control issuing proclamations as to what was recommended, what wasn't recommended, that everybody else was supposed to be following. You had the EEOC with this continuous update, and there's a guidance they kept publishing that's been revised 7, 8, 9, 10 times since 18 months ago as to what should be done, and now adds a component to what we do about vaccines. And you had the Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor, getting involved in who was going to take time off when and how you were going to pay people for hours. And now you have OSHA. It's almost humorous, but the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is now trying to come up with guidelines and rules. They just promulgated a rule for comment on November 7th about how to deal with the pandemic. And I will just tell you that from an employer's perspective, they've been white-knuckled since March 13th. And they're still somewhat white-knuckled about what to do now. Do you bring people back? Do you require that they get tested? Who pays for the testing? How do you get people to get vaccinated? How do you deal with people who can't get vaccinated? Um, and it's been a real fun ride. I just want to skip ahead on a couple of things. Let Behind all of these ideas are the concept of accommodation, which circles back to the United States approach to employment and the Americans with Disabilities Act. If a person can't get vaccinated because of a medical condition, I have an in-law who has a severe allergic reaction to the flu vaccine, despite the fact that she is a pediatric anesthesiologist working in a children's hospital with very sick kids. Now, consider she can't get vaccinated. Now, is she exposing all of those children to the disease? No, because she's, of course, scrubbing before she's going to surgery. She's wearing PPE. She's wearing surgical masks. She's using gloves. She's sitting over on another part of the room monitoring the the anesthesia. So there is an accommodation. They can accommodate here. They can make it possible for her to do her job, despite the fact that for medical reasons she cannot be vaccinated. Um, and the accommodation has to be reasonable. So, and it can't be unduly burdensome on the employer. So I have a number of clients, for example, who have inside salespeople and outside salespeople. And the outside salespeople go into doctors' offices trying to sell their product. Well, the inside salespeople, clearly we can accommodate if there is a medical reason they can't be vaccinated. They can work from home. They've been working from home for most of the last 18 months. The outside salespeople, not so much. The essential function of their job is going out and meeting other people. If they can't do that because they're not vaccinated, they can't perform the essential functions of their job. It would be unreasonable for the employer to accommodate them. So some of my clients have been laying their outside salespeople off because they refuse to be vaccinated. That's reasonable. That's unassailable. And what I've said to a number of clients who've called me as employees, I had one in particular who said, "Well, I feel it's sort of like Reverend Jacobson. I feel that it is my liberty. It is my liberty and independence to declare what I ingest into my body." I know he sounds a little like Aaron Rodgers, um, but my answer to him was, no, actually, you are free to work for an employer that doesn't require you to be vaccinated. That's what you're free to do. You're not free to expose others to a, a an infectious agent that you refuse to inoculate yourself from. They're not very happy with that, but I haven't taken any anti-vaxxer cases because the right case hasn't come up yet. Now, a second type of accommodation is religious accommodation. There are some who have sincerely held religious beliefs that um, that are contrary to vaccination. Um, they believe that God is the supreme healer and that prayer is the best way to resolve those challenges that come to the physical body. And they sincerely believe that. They don't take medication. They don't do blood transfusions. They don't believe in medical intervention of any kind. And they can sincerely state that this vaccination is no different than any other vaccination, none of which they have ever gotten because of their sincerely held religious beliefs. And the model there is the same in many respects as it would be for the Americans with Disabilities Act. What are the essential functions of their job? Can we reasonably accommodate them? And you have the same situation. If this is an outside salesperson, this is somebody who has to mingle, has to be out and about with others. They can't be accommodated. On the other hand, if they're an inside salesperson, if they're working in an office, if they're working in a cubicle, they can be accommodated, and they can be accommodated in many ways. One way is they have to be masked, whereas workers who are vaccinated don't have to be masked. They may have to test on a regular basis, whereas others who are vaccinated don't have to test. They may have to stay 6 feet apart or stay out of break rooms or stay out of certain areas at the workplace. I've had people call me and complain about that too, where they said they were granted a religious exemption, but now they're unhappy about having to be masked, stay out of break rooms, and so forth. And my answer to them again is, you've chosen you've chosen to adopt this belief system. You're entitled to your belief system. This is the downside of what happens. Um, that's the way it goes. Now, OSHA is working on some mandatory testing guidelines. We don't know. We've seen a little sample of what they are. I have to be honest. The Federal Register dropped within the last 24 hours. It was 154 pages, and no, I didn't get through all 154 pages before speaking to you today. Interestingly, it's 154 pages, but there's only about 5 pages of regulations. It's sort of amazing when they promulgate regulations. You see this huge preface and then a very short actual regulations, and that's what you're supposed to submit your comments on. It's easy to get lost, but um, they are talking about, does the employer pay for mandatory testing, or should the employee have to pay for mandatory testing, um, and things like that.
Harold, I want to ask you, and then you'll continue, but I want to ask you, I believe the internet has had a huge influence in this particular issue of vaccine testing. Although I think in the past there might have been outlier people who complained, now there are millions of people who are complaining about the testing. And sometimes they engage in false science that they've read on the internet. And I think also the political administration, the last political administration, that stressed a lot of individual rights. I think those things have really created a firestorm with these particular issues. I can't recall my career ever getting a call from anyone before COVID asking whether they would have to be mandatorily tested or take a vaccine. So what is your opinion on that? Do you agree those two things had a major influence on this firestorm that has been created?
The war on science has been going on for a while, but it's particularly problematic now. Um, and the internet has made everybody an expert.
Yes.
But we still have standards for who we believe and who we don't. I've seen some very funny New Yorker cartoons about should we call the doctor, or should we go online and find other people who are with authority, who say what we want them to say.
Right.
Um, you have the Centers for Disease Control, which are pretty authoritative. You also have in this battle against science, you have people who are paranoid about what the government is saying and doing. I just read today, within the last 2 hours, 38% of the public believe that the government is artificially inflating the number of deaths from COVID-19. Now, why would the government have an incentive to inflate the number of deaths? Well, if you're paranoid, if you believe in the black helicopters, you go, well, the government's in cahoots with the pharmaceutical industry because the pharmaceutical industry has a lot of lobbyists. And, it's hard to challenge that, because last week, 2 weeks ago, at the environmental summit in Europe, there were two lobbyists in the oil and gas industry for every delegate. It's the battle against, for years you had Exxon arguing there's no climate change, and now you have them saying, we always believed there was climate change. It's really reminiscent of 1984 and the memory hole. We have always been at war against Eurasia. Um, employers have to go with authoritative sources, just like courts. We have the Fry standard and we have the Daubert standard. And before an expert is allowed to give testimony, opinion evidence of a scientific nature in a court of law, they have to pass what's known as the Daubert standard based on the Daubert case. And some states like Pennsylvania still adopt the Fry standard, which is an older standard, but it has to be generally accepted. You don't take fringe theories, you take what's generally accepted. Cloth masks. We've seen and heard all kinds of things about cloth masks. Maybe cloth masks protect me from you, but they definitely protect you from me. And that's enough in a public health environment. So we don't need to get too far into the weeds. Is it KN95? Is it N95? Was it a counterfeit, made somewhere in Asia and shipped here illegally? A cloth mask will protect others from you. So, as a courtesy, you wear a cloth mask. There are nations where nobody has a problem with wearing a mask. They wear them all the time. It's not a big deal. Um, you don't have to dig down. Vaccinations have worked for ages. Um, Nonsense about vaccinations causing autism were from a doctor who has since been busted, gone to jail, and lost his license. And yet his article, which has been retracted and widely criticized, is still cited as a basis for vaccinations causing autism. And there is absolutely no link. The problem is people take the drug they want to take. And if their feed is the one that tells them falsehoods about public health, there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do. It's really comes down to, why is America so polarized? It's polarized because now you can be addicted to the feed you want to be addicted to, and you don't have to deal with the actual reality of the world because you only get the feed that's coming to you. So, what we're telling employers to do, and what I'm telling employers to do and have been telling them, is require vaccination. And tell your employees, if you have a medical reason or a religious reason for not wanting to be vaccinated, let me know what it is, and we will attempt to accommodate you. You have to be careful in what you ask, but you're allowed to ask them, why is it you feel medically you can't be vaccinated? You can do that without being too prying. The Americans with Disabilities Act does require what is known as a constructive dialogue. So if the employee's response is, I'm not going to tell you that, that's not a constructive dialogue, and the ADA does not protect them. On the other hand, if the employee says, well, I'm being treated for allergic reactions, and I have an EpiPen with me, and I have serious allergies, and I know that some vaccines have caused allergic reactions, and I'm concerned that this one might, and I really don't want to, then it's really not necessarily necessary for the employer to go much beyond perhaps asking the allergist for an opinion or a letter, but not getting into well, what were the other incidents? What happened? Were they bee stings? That's too prying. An employer doesn't need to know that. The same thing with the religious. The religious aspects. If somebody says they're an apostolic Pentecostalist or a Christian Scientist or a Jehovah's Witness, their beliefs are pretty well known and can be easily seen on their websites. And there's no reason to go, well, how often do you go to church? When's the last time you went to church? Who is your minister? There's no reason for an employer to be that intrusive. That can trigger claims of retaliation for the employee trying to seek an accommodation and being responded to by the employer ignorantly, or an employer saying, I don't care what your exception is, I don't care what your religion is, I don't care what your medical exception is, everyone in here is going to be vaccinated or else. That's going to run an employer afoul of employment laws, state, federal employment laws as well.
I've noticed there's a hardening on both sides as this issue has continued. Employees, if I tell them they may be terminated in this process, can they get another job at a similar salary before they really make this important decision? I don't think they believe that will happen. And if it does happen, I think they will definitely, be entitled to receive unemployment compensation, which is not a given.
Right.
On the employer side, I've seen more of a hardening that this is our policy, take it or leave it. And I think it's just going to continue into the future. But what surprises me is that people don't seem to feel anyone has any modicum of control over them, and that they really can't do something to them. And I think that's a dangerous feeling because I think, and belief, because I think many people will be unemployed in the future and be very shocked that they're not receiving benefits because the employer would be contesting that.
That's true, and the courts have been generally unsympathetic. There's a great case out of Texas. Bridges is the case versus, I think, Houston Medical Center, Houston Methodist Medical Center, and this was from almost a year ago, or about 8 to 9 months ago, where a group of nurses claimed they didn't want to be vaccinated. They felt that it was an impermissible intrusion. They sued the hospital. They said that this was the same, and this was a horrible argument. They said that it was the same thing as human experimentation, such as was done in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And that argument was characterized by the trial court as, quote, reprehensible, close
Mhm.
quote. And I'll just mention, and I'm sure, Faye, you know this, if you're an advocate for a client, the last thing you want is for the court to call your argument reprehensible. That just does not bode well for the rest of the case. And they said in that decision, they said Miss Bridges is free to get a nursing gig at any other place she wants to work where they don't require vaccination. But the hospital has an interest in protecting its patients, its coworkers, its doctors, and the public. And to require vaccination to protect all of those people as a hospital is completely reasonable. You, Miss Bridges, not so much. And I think you are going to see people not getting unemployment benefits and suddenly realize, oh, they're serious about this. I think if you see a little bit less of a war against science, you may see more people become vaccinated. I think, unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is the pandemic will become endemic in the next 6 months to a year. And COVID-19 will become much like the flu, where those of us who choose to get flu vaccines every year will get them. Those of us who choose to get COVID-19 vaccines every year will get them. And this horrible surge that led to more than 700,000 deaths will go away, and we'll live to fight this another day. What I find terrifying is I was listening to an interview of Bill Nye was interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson in March of 2020 in New York City at the 92nd Street Y, just before the world shut down. And he was saying, we're going to wash our hands, folks, right? We're going to be careful because we couldn't possibly replicate what happened in 1918. And then 100 years later, look what happens. Um, there will be more COVID-19s. There will be more pandemics. I can only hope that we will handle it with a little more uh, a little more intellectual maturity than we have handled this one, because this one absolutely boggled my mind how this one went down.
Do you feel that litigation will ensue? I mean, there have really been very few cases that have made their way to courts. As you said, all of the agencies have weighed in. Quite often, there are many changes. There are contrary rulings. There are decisions every few days. It's very confusing for the average worker and the employer. Very confusing for the employer. So, do you think at some point that there will be some better set policy? Either the courts will set it or some other way, so that we will know how to go forward as different strains may come forward also.
I'm hoping that, like, the Fifth Circuit just invalidated the vaccine mandate, and I read today actually that they're expecting other challenges to the vaccine mandate, and then the Department of Justice is sort of going to pick by lottery which one they want to take up to the Supreme Court. And I'm hoping the Supreme Court will reaffirm Jacobson versus Massachusetts. I could see them maybe providing some sort of guideline, but the bottom line is it does not come down to a constitutional issue. Um, it's about public health, and I think that the courts have generally not been particularly sympathetic. I think where you might see some litigation is going to be on the accommodation front. What is a reasonable accommodation? What is the onus on an employer to provide for a religious accommodation, to provide for a accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You may see some tweaking of that. I think independent of the accommodation environment, because that's what's the scariest part. I don't see a lot of success on the employee side. You could see something in wage and hour. If somebody is required to get a vaccine, is that on the clock or off the clock? But I think for the most part, employers are smart enough to say, if I'm requiring you to get a vaccine, I'm making it on the clock, so I don't have to deal with the Fair Labor Standards Act claim down the road for violation of wage and hour laws. So I think the focus is going to be in the accommodation area, and I think it's going to be over within 2 years. I think that 2 years from now, the public seems to only have a memory of 24 months. And I think, 2 years from now, the pandemic will be well behind us and the cases will be working themselves out. And in 4 or 5 years, people are going to go, what pandemic? What are you talking about? Oh, you mean Spanish flu, 1918? No. Yeah. We do not have as a culture, we don't have a long memory.
Well, thank you, Harold, for your very informative talk, and thank you for discussing some of the issues that arise in my practice with me. I'm more on the employment end. Harold is more on the employer end, and we like to have these dialogues on a regular basis with employment attorneys. I learned many things today. Thank you for taking the time to search the history on these issues. And the University of Minnesota, thank you for allowing us to give this presentation. And I look forward to meeting more University of Minnesota alumni in this area. COVID has put the kibosh a little bit on any personal meetings. We're a fairly new chapter, and we are looking forward to seeing more members and talking with members and talking about good things in Minnesota. So thank you very much, and have a good day and stay healthy.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.